Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Resilient Advisor. My name is Jay Coulter. This is part of the Investment Spotlight series. Chris, we had an opportunity to interview Doug Drysdale of Cybin. What are your thoughts on the company?
Well, I got to say, Jay, that we've chatted with a number of companies that are looking to disrupt the healthcare industry, pharmaceuticals in particular. But this story, I got to tell you, it is something different because it's dealing with mental health. And I was fascinated by the areas that Doug and his team are really focused in on, whether it's depressive order, alcohol abuse, and more recently, they added anxiety to the lineup. And to me, that makes what they're doing extremely relatable. You know the statistics far better than I do, Jay, but I think almost everyone knows someone who is suffering from this. And the potential of the treatments that they're offering seem really, really breakthrough. The only caveat that I would have is that, again, we're early here. And the company's not really going to have, it sounds like, revenue for a couple of years. They are well capitalized, but I think this is going to be a developing story. So if you're an investor who's kicking the tires on this, make sure you understand the total available market opportunity, the competitive landscape, and we talk about that on the podcast here. But also, you have to be patient. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, I was very impressed with Doug. I was very impressed with their mission and what they wanted to accomplish. Yeah. I share at the end how passionate I am, as my audience already knows, about mental health and advocacy in that space. And they're trying to do something about it. And as listeners will hear in the disclaimer we're about to run, Chris and I aren't going to invest in these companies, but I am a big fan. Hope you guys enjoyed this interview with Doug Drysdale of Cybin.
Jay Coulter and Chris Versace do not own any interest in the companies that they interview at the time of the recording or 30 days after the initial release of the show.
This interview is part of the Investment Spotlight series on Resilient Advisor. My name is Jay Coulter, and my partner in this series is Chris Versace, the Chief Investment Officer at Tematica Research. In this interview, we're speaking with Doug Drysdale, the CEO of Cybin, a company focused on progressing psychedelic therapeutics. Cybin trades on the NEO under the symbol CYBN. Doug, what is the investment thesis of Cybin through a financial advisor's lens?
So literally, we're looking to revolutionize mental health care, literally looking to change how we treat mental illness. There's not been not a lot of innovation in psychiatry for the last 30 years. And these psychedelic drugs that we're repurposing have the potential to completely change the mental health landscape.
So, Doug, one of my favorite books is Always Start with Why. And you just said two things there that really capture my thought on that. First one is, why mental health? Why is that a target-rich market? We hear so much about the aging of the population, for example, and diabetes and other things. We know that's a big opportunity. How big and why is mental health a big opportunity for Cybin?
Well, the COVID crisis has really exacerbated everything, really. I mean, we've seen a 42% increase in overdoses. We've seen a 3 times increase in anxiety. And I think just a general awareness and a willingness to talk about mental health and overcome the stigma. So I think now couldn't be a better time to be attacking these issues.
And why, the second why is, why psychedelics? Is there something in particular about them? And I ask that against the broader landscape of, pharmaceutical alternatives that we're hearing about, everything from, including cannabis and others, but why the focus on psychedelics?
Now, these are like a pharmaceutical intervention, right? We've been, they really are. And I mean that literally, in that we've been treating depression and addiction chronically for decades and barely keeping those symptoms at bay in the best case. What studies have shown with psychedelics is that they can work really fast. They can have an effect size that might be 4 times the current treatments like SSRIs, and they can last for months at a time. So that's really intervening. Imagine freeing an addictive patient of their cravings for months at a time. That's really life-changing.
So there's a variety, you mentioned a few, but there's a variety of areas of mental health. Which areas is Cybin focusing on, and why those ones in particular?
So we're focused on depression, alcohol use disorder, and then this morning we announced that we're also focusing on anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, and social anxiety disorder. So these are enormous conditions. They affect 700 million people around the world. We spend $20 billion a year on drugs for these conditions. So enormous markets, enormous unmet needs.
And where are we in psychedelics being used to address this market? Because again, and I apologize for comparing it to cannabis, but we know that there are companies that are working on certain formulations to address, let's just say, medicinal applications. But there's a lot of interest there. Is Cybin early to the market? Is Cybin kind of hitting the tipping point in awareness for this?
Yeah, we're really focused on generating second generation psychedelics. So we know a lot about these molecules. Some of them were discovered decades ago, but they're all flawed in some way or other. Some are too short acting, some are too long acting, some you can't get into the bloodstream orally very easily. So we're using medicinal chemistry and drug delivery to develop treatments that are therapeutically useful, shorter acting, fast acting, and designed for these particular conditions.
Can you give us an example of one, again, understanding that there might be certain things you can't reveal, but an example of one aspect of mental health that you're attacking, what the molecule generally is and what the shortcoming might have been with it that you've needed to overcome?
Yeah, so I can tell you about our alcohol use disorder treatment, which is a deuterated tryptamine. I know that's very, very scientific.
Wait, hang on one second, Doug. Jay, say that 3 times fast.
Not going to do it unless I can edit it.
So this particular molecule that we're using is very short acting. It's like a rocket ride. Literally, patients go up to the moon and back in a very short space of time and have side effects associated with that. So therapeutically, that's not very practical. What we're doing is we're replacing hydrogen atoms on these molecules with deuterium, which is heavy hydrogen, and it has the ability to smooth out that rocket ride into something that's much more pleasant for the patient, less side effects, and a longer duration, so we can have this psychedelic effect.
It sounds almost like the flavor of melatonin that I take, Doug, that is time release, so it's a little smoother. It doesn't, hit and then I wake up all groggy or I wake up in the middle of the night, something like that.
Yeah, it's a bit like that, but we're using chemistry instead of drug delivery. But it's essentially like that to make the drug more therapeutically useful. That's right.
Okay, so you mentioned depressive order, alcohol use, and anxiety. How did you zero in on those 3 markets? And are they kind of under attacked, if you will, by competitors?
Well, they're all sort of under-treated for sure, and they're all interrelated. So people often develop anxieties early in their life, and people with anxiety go on to develop depression. People that have depression often turn to substances. So these are interrelated conditions, really kind of a similar target audience, similar group of physicians that are treating these. But there's a lot of data around these molecules, work done at Johns Hopkins and at NYU and Imperial College in London, that gives us really strong confidence that these psychedelic molecules have potential to be effective in these conditions.
And you just mentioned that these 3 particular target markets for you are related. Does that mean that the molecules you're using are also related, so you can kind of really leverage your R&D, or are they very different solutions?
They're all deuterated tryptamines, right? So they're all in the same class, but they all have different properties, and we're combining them with drug delivery to tackle the properties. One is a sublingual film that goes under the tongue and develops and dissolves very quickly for depression. Another is an orally disintegrating tablet that we're using for alcohol use disorder. And another, the third for anxiety, we're using an inhalation device because you can't get it into the bloodstream orally. So it's about combining the chemistry with the drug delivery to get the drug into the bloodstream most effectively.
So when you're researching these molecules and developing your solutions, is it more on developing the right formulation of the molecule itself, or is it more on the drug delivery? Because you rattled off 3 different, solutions with 3 different drug deliveries. And how does that, and I'm just curious, sorry, when you're testing and stuff, how many iterations of drug deliveries do you have to go through to really nail the right one?
Yeah, it's really about the properties of the individual molecule. And we know a lot about these, as I mentioned, because the parent scaffolds of these molecules have been around for several decades. So we know what the flaws are. But when we're looking to develop these for certain conditions, it's not just about the chemistry and the delivery, it's also about other factors. So what's the prevalence of the disease that we're looking to address? What are the clinical endpoints that we can measure? What are those endpoints that are going to be acceptable by EMA and FDA? Can we get these things approved? And then what's the clinical plan? How do we take it through preclinical work and through the clinic and develop realistic studies that we think will have a good outcome?
So a whole host of questions coming out of that, Doug. I'll see if I can get them all. So you did mention the FDA, which is obviously a big one. It sounds to me like you're starting to gather information, and based on what we know, or I should say, and your team, you're trying to map out the information that will be requested, so you have the testing time, you have the test information ready to address those questions, so you can collapse time to market. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, I think that's true. The FDA has already granted breakthrough therapy status to psilocybin and to MDMA. So they've given kind of the green light that they recognize these molecules have huge potential. But there is a long path to market with these molecules. The good news is, because we are modifying molecules that we know a lot about, we can already have confidence around the safety and the efficacy. We just have to go through those placebo-controlled studies to meet the needs of the FDA.
So where are you in the testing for that? Are you in testing round 1, 2, 3, or have you yet to begin?
So our anxiety program and our alcohol use program are in preclinical stage, so they're in animal studies right now. We expect to be in man in the clinic for alcohol use disorder early 2022, so pretty soon, and for anxiety in maybe mid-2022. Our depressive program is more advanced. We just received approval to start a phase 2 study for major depressive disorder. So that study will take about a year to run, and we should have data coming out of that in mid-2022.
And are there any geographic markets that are more friendly towards what you're doing, say the Canada, Europe, or compared to the US, that there might be opportunities there?
Well, I'd say that regulator attitudes are changing more around the world, actually, getting more positive. There are some practical conditions when you're trying to move Schedule 1 drugs around. Every time you try to cross a border, things get a little challenging, right? So we are building verticals in Canada and in the UK, actually, where we're doing our chemical synthesis, our preclinical work, and our clinical first-in-man programs, all in those same geographies in a particular vertical, just for practical purposes.
Okay. And again, we know that this is a long roadmap. You just referenced, probably what we consider the short to medium term roadmap of 2022, 2023, that sort of thing. But as you look at your multi-year planning, are there any, to the extent you can share it, are there other markets that you're looking to address besides the 3 that you talked about, or are these really like the core 3 and there's a lot to be done there?
Yeah, so our main focus is on North America and Western Europe, the EU, for sure. I mean, those are the largest markets by far. I suspect that we'll enter into partnerships when it comes to commercialization in Europe, and likely in Asia as well. Japan's also a very large market. Although, of course, culturally, dealing with depression and anxiety is different in each of those markets. In the US and in Canada, we're looking to build our own commercial organization. But it's not likely we'll have a drug on the market before maybe 2025 at this point.
So I think Doug was using one of my favorite words, which is licensing. He didn't say it, but I think that's what he's getting to. And, is that a path to market faster, do you think, Doug? Or do you like that business model? One, for the reasons I do, because it's got really high margins, it's low capacity intensive, and you can partner with some of the best and the brightest companies to really expand the reach and leverage their infrastructure.
Yeah, all of those things are right. And for us, trying to build a commercial infrastructure across 26, 27 countries in the EU would just take too long and take too much capital. Right? It's very complex. Each one of those, even though there's a central regulatory process, each country has their own unique demands as well. So working with a partner, when it comes to that time, we're not quite there yet, working with a partner would just make the most sense. As you say, it's speed and better margins that way.
Is there, you mentioned that there's some work being done and the FDA has already kind of greenlit certain other solutions that fall under psychedelics. For the listener there, so they can wrap their head around this a little better, are there any large pharma companies that are kind of collaborating with companies similar to yourself in those particular markets, not the ones that you're addressing?
Well, we have a couple of other competitors in the space, or I should say, people working on the same kinds of molecules, like Compass Pathways, who are listed on the NASDAQ, and MindMed, also listed on the NASDAQ, all working in the same space. Not exactly the same molecules and not exactly the same mental health disorders, but they're very well capitalized. There are some big companies also in this area. Johnson & Johnson has developed esketamine for depression. That's a form of psychedelic. So there's been a lot of interest here. And recently we saw Jazz Pharmaceuticals purchase GW Pharma from us. So there's an increasing awareness in these sort of alternative medicines, if you like.
Yeah, I think everybody likes to point to that acquisition as kind of the holy grail of what could be. But I think you're right, though. I mean, look, these large companies, they have their own R&D, but they can't, research and develop, let's just say everything. But I do think that, it's one thing to have the formulations and get the FDA studies. I do agree, I think, with your strategy that having proof of concept in terms of product on the ground really goes a long way to establishing credibility for what you're trying to do. So you mentioned that one of your competitors is, I think you said, very well capitalized, but I believe, Doug, so are you. So let's pivot for a second and talk about the balance sheet. How much cash is on that? And just in terms of quarters, if you could frame it that way, how much runway does that give you?
Oh, we're very well capitalized. We have about $60 million on the balance sheet today. That puts us well out into 2023 and well through our phase 2 program for depression. And I think we'll have opportunity between now and then to raise more capital if we need to.
And I assume that there are certain hurdles or milestones that you think you'll pass that will make that a little easier. Fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely right. Each time you move into a different phase of development, I think that increases the confidence that the drugs come to market and increases the proof of concept. So definitely getting through the preclinical work for our anxiety program, our alcohol program into man early next year is a big milestone. Getting started with our phase 2 program in the near future with depression, I think, is a big milestone. We're also doing some other interesting studies. We're just sponsoring a study at the University of Washington using psilocybin in frontline healthcare workers that are facing burnout or depression due to COVID-19. I think that's going to be fascinating, and also being able to help that population. And we're also doing an interesting neuroimaging study, looking at the brain using a wearable neuroimaging device and collecting real-time brain activity data during the psychedelic treatment. So lots and lots of milestones coming over the next 6 months or so.
So it sounds like there's, a lot of opportunity ahead of the company. You're capitalized, so that's not really a risk per se, but what are some of the risks that, say, keep you awake at night, making sure, did we do this? Are we on track for this?
Yeah, it's really about execution. We're moving very quickly, we're growing very fast. We've gone from, a startup to maybe 50 or 60 people within a year, and we have many programs ongoing. The good news is that we know a lot about these molecules, the history, the metabolism, the chemistry, the safety profile. But we've now got to translate those smaller academic studies that have been done to collect that data into larger placebo-controlled FDA studies. So it's really just about execution and taking that data forward and repeating it.
So when I hear execution, I think quality control, I think team. Talk to us about the team, because obviously, Doug, while you're the man in charge, we like to say, you have to have breadth, you have to have depth that allows you to research these molecules as well as understand the FDA processing and testing. So talk to us about the bench, if you will.
Yeah, the team is phenomenal. We're extremely fortunate. They've published over 300 peer-reviewed papers. They've managed more than 60 development programs with the FDA, filed more than 85 patents. In fact, our team was part of the group that developed esketamine for J&J. So they have practical experience of both psychedelics and developing pharmaceuticals.
And is it fair to say that you are either locking them up or enticing them to over the long term in terms of staying with the company and helping it become successful?
Yeah, obviously we have an active options program. The management team's heavily incentivized. Our founders still own a big chunk of the company, haven't sold a share. We're in this for the long haul, for sure.
Excellent. And what kind of investors are you attracting? Either, let's just say on the institutional side, are these folks who are digging in deep and understand the transformation that's happening in how we treat a variety of illnesses, including mental illness? So they're long-term patient investors?
Absolutely. So the last 2 rounds, 90 to 95% of the investors were large US blue chip biotech funds. So groups like Janus Henderson, Lifeside Ventures, RA Capital, and a whole range of others that I can't name, unfortunately.
No, it's fine.
We didn't, but we're largely held by those major blue chip funds.
Okay, and are folks, not folks, but companies, are they as you publish studies, papers, and protect your IP, I assume with some patent filings, are people starting to take notice? And again, large pharmaceutical companies.
I think pharma is starting to take notice. You mentioned IP. We've filed 12 patents to date, and more to come. So we're building a big IP moat around what we're doing. It's important to protect that. As there's investment going in here. I think over the next couple of years, as patents in this space really start to issue, and the details of those fall out, I think you'll start to see big pharma really paying attention. At the moment, there are a number of companies in the space at early stage. Big pharma can afford to wait, and I think you'll see some transactions in the next 18 to 24 months or so.
No, that's actually an interesting comment. So typically when we see a new wave of something, a lot of people tend to think about technology. We could use 5G, for example. There are a lot of companies that look to attack that newfound market opportunity because of the promise of explosive growth. Then there tends to be some rationalization that happens, whether it's mergers or acquisitions. Still in the early stage for psychedelics?
Yeah, but I think it's beginning to shift. So we are MJDS eligible for a US tier 1 exchange. So hopefully we'll be listed in the US in the very near future. There are 3 or 4 other companies that will be listed around the same time. And so you're starting to see a pack pull away from the rest, a group that is well capitalized and can really accelerate their programs. The other 40 or 50 companies that have started in the last year, like you say, a wave, which is natural, can't all get access to the capital that they need. So I do think there will be a wave of consolidation over the next 18 or 24 months or
so. Just out of curiosity, based on that comment, do you see the amount of venture dollars that's chasing this market starting to slow?
No, actually, not at all. I think with these US uplifts, we're seeing more and more people jump in with the opportunity with the increased liquidity.
So it sounds like, at least in the short term, not that the true competitors will tighten, but there's going to be, I guess I would say, a lot of noise in and around the space. What would you suggest to someone who's either looking at the opportunity or trying to zero in on Cybin in particular? What are the things to focus on?
Look, I think you've got to have IP. So if you're looking at any company in the space, you've got to have IP, and the IP space is getting more crowded every day. So that's important. Got to have a team with a track record. And we've seen several companies in the space that don't necessarily have a pharmaceutical team. And I can tell you, developing drugs is not an easy thing to do. You've got to have that experience, and got to be well capitalized. Drug development's very, very expensive. So I think we have all of those things. We also have major partnerships with leading firms like Catalent and Covance that have been doing this for decades, and we can rely on their ecosystems as well to help bring our drugs to market.
Excellent. Jay, anything?
Yeah. So, Doug, normally when we wrap up these, you can see how well Chris does asking questions and getting deep into the balance sheet. And then I generally talk about how it could potentially fit into an investment portfolio and what advisors should consider. But I want to take a different path this time and tell you a story. In 2008, I worked for Lehman Brothers. I'd been there about a decade. They went out of business around the same time my daughter was born, 3 months premature. She was less than a pound. She fit in my hand. About 6 months later, I went through a depressive episode. I had no idea what it was. It was the most miserable 12 months of my life. I mistakenly tried to get myself better and did it over the course of about a year. And then I fanatically researched mental health. I can tell you all the statistics about depression and anxiety. I built a knack for being able to identify it in other people, but I kept it all to myself. Then a couple of years later, I lost someone really close to me to suicide. And that's when I realized this isn't just an epidemic, it's a silent epidemic. My wife and I started a nonprofit where it was a podcast and a book called Conquer Worry. That book, and it's a bad book, sold on 5 continents because this is such a big problem. Later, when I started this consulting business and show, I called it Resilient Advisor for a reason. I found that the financial advisor clients I were working with struggled more with the mental health issues of running their business and were not getting help. And I wanted to use it as a chassis to get in there. Doug, the work that you guys are doing goes well beyond just the numbers, the balance sheet, and the income statement. While Chris and I do not invest in companies that we interview, you have a big fan in Atlanta, Georgia with Jay Coulter, and we really hope you guys find a lot of success with what you do.
Thank you, Jay. It means a lot. And I can tell you that it's a similar story for many people at Cybin. You know, as we built the team, we've just seen an enormous passion from those people that have come on board, and a bonding really from a kind of shared wish to help people, because we all know someone that's been impacted by depression or addiction. It's ubiquitous. And yeah, well, it's an honor to get up every morning and try and help those people.
I mean, I love the fervor, the passion. I just have to ask the question, are you guys a bunch of zealots, a bunch of pirates, Doug? Are you guys going to revolutionize the world?
We are. We're going to revolutionize mental health care. Imagine if you could just with 1 or 2 treatments remove someone's addiction or their depression for months at a time. It's life-changing.
Well, I think I could say, speak for both Jay and myself, Doug, that you do have a timetable ahead of you, and we would love to have you back, in 6 months, 9 months, as you have more positive news to share.
That'd be great, guys. Thank you for having me today. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Awesome job, Doug. I had something else scripted I was going to say. I didn't connect the dots for what you were doing. And I meant what I said. I'm a big fan. I'm going to be pulling for you guys. You guys are actually making a difference in the world and not widgets for people to play with.
We all have these stories, right? I find it really hard to talk about. I get choked up every time I talk about these, and I hear someone's story. It makes me, just makes me so emotional. My mom died from lung cancer, but it was her addiction that killed her. She was smoking. My father's sister got depressed after she lost her husband and became an alcoholic, and eventually took her own life. And I can tell you, every single person at Cybin has a story like that. And it's sad. It's just awful. You're absolutely right, Jay, when you said this is a silent epidemic. Mm-hmm. It's just all around us, and we just continue. We just keep going on.
So the stat I always go back to. If the American Psychological Association tells us that 17%, and this is American data, of Americans struggle with anxiety, 6% depression at any given time, right? So if that's roughly 25% and there's one person in their life that cares about them, half the population is dealing with it right now, this very second. And in our industry, it's significantly higher. It just has to.
You're right. And then it's not just that individual. One of our colleagues often says that he thinks mental illness is an infectious disease, in that it affects everyone around the person as well. They're all impacted in some way. So.
Well, think of how you alter your behavior around a known anxious individual or an alcoholic or something like that. It's unreal. It's unreal. Well, I will say this, that this to me was probably the most fascinating one that we've done. And I can say this unequivocally, that in terms of the management teams that have been on, in terms of the way they've delivered their message, conviction, you stand out among them.
Well, thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
No, it's great. It's absolutely great.
Important information. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security, and you should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All information has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, but its accuracy is not guaranteed. There is no representation or warranty as to the current accuracy, reliability, or completeness of, nor liability for, decisions based on such information, and it should not be relied on as such. Pinger Systems, LLC, doing business as Resilient Advisor, was compensated for the production of this content.